Okay, hello YouTube. Today we're going to be talking about an opening called the English opening, which happens after one pawn to c4. And if you like content like this and you want to see more of it, please go ahead and hit that subscribe button and please click on your notification icon. So the move I'm going to be recommending against 1c4 is the move 1 to c5. This is actually called the symmetrical English. So why am I suggesting that you play the symmetrical English? It seems like out of all of the options that you can play against the English, this is the most boring option. So, number one, it's not as boring as you might think. There's actually a lot of exciting ideas behind it that you can try. At certain points, you can break symmetry. You can get advantages. There's pawn sacrifices. It's just like any other opening. There's a lot of really good ideas, especially if you understand what's going on. Another reason that I'm suggesting the symmetrical English, and another reason that I'm a big proponent of it, and a big reason that I like to play it, is when you look at the other options inherent against playing against the English, like if you look at e5, knight f6, or knight f6 followed by g6, or knight f6 followed by e6, there are a lot of transpositions that white can throw at you. Basically, you're giving white a free hand to play whatever opening he wants, which means that you have to be prepared to play against whatever opening white wants. So that's a huge mountain of theory that you have to be prepared for. When you play c5, and you take your fair share of the center away from white, you have really seriously reduced white's options. You've reduced the number of things that white can do against you. You've basically reduced it to 3 things that white can do. White can play knight c3, which has already basically signaled his intention that he wants to just kind of hang back and do nothing. So he can hang back and do nothing. And what I mean by that is not break in the middle with d4. So basically this comes down to, is white going to break in the middle with d4, or is he going to not break in the middle with d4? Once you've played c5, that's the question, that's the debate. So white can choose to hang back and play moves like knight c3, g3, bishop g2, etc., and just do nothing and just not play d4 anytime soon. The other thing white can do is white can play for an early d4. White can play the move knight f3 and then follow that up really quickly. Like let's say knight f6, he can follow that up really quickly with a move like d4. He can play d4 immediately. Okay, so he can play d4 within the first couple of moves. And then another thing he can do is he can try to do a hybrid of those two. He can play knight f3 and pretend like he's going to play d4, wait to see your response, and then choose to hang back. Of course, if he does this, he gives you an opportunity to play d5, and this is where some of that asymmetry comes in. So he can hang back and do nothing. He can play d4 himself really early. He can threaten to play d4 and then hang back. Those are his 3 options, so that's basically what you have to deal with. So now I would say on the lower levels, a lot of people like to hang back. A lot of people like to play knight c3 and hang back, making it very difficult to play d4. This makes black's strategy really easy. Okay, this also makes the position just look like black is copying white because things start getting really symmetrical really fast. But basically, as soon as white hangs back with the move knight c3 and says, I don't want to play d4, you need to immediately start piling pieces on that d4 square so that he can't play d4. So you're going to go ahead and play a move like knight c6 to control that d4 square, and after he plays the move g3, you're going to copy him and you're going to play g6. But again, you're not copying him just for the sake of copying him. I want to make that really clear. You happen to be copying him because your goal is, again, to control the d4 square and keep him from playing an early d4. That's why you're playing g6. And you would play g6 against the move knight f3. You would still play g6. So you're not really copying his moves. You're simply following through with what your strategy is once he made the decision to hang back with the move knight c3. So like if he played knight f3, you would continue with g6, and then after d4, you would play cd4, knight d4, bishop g7, and that's why that one slack move that he played, knight c3, doesn't allow him to revert back to the plan of just going for this early d4. He has to now prep d4 with moves like e3, etc., before he can get in d4. And there's one exception to that. It's actually one of the current main lines, and we'll go over that in a minute. So after bishop g7, white would be forced to play something passive like e3 or knight c2. So let's say g3, g6, bishop g2, bishop g7, and now we have a couple of options. One thing that we could do here as white is we would play e3, and then we would continue to appear like we're copying white, and we would play the move pawn to e6, again, because we have to keep this knight and this bishop attacking that d4 square. We're not going to respond asymmetrically with a move like knight to f6. We're going to just continue to play e6, tuck that knight in behind with knight on g to e7, and then continue our development naturally. So if they continued with knight on g to e2, we would keep copying them for quite a while, and we wouldn't break symmetry until they did something on this move. So if, for example, they played rook b1, we wouldn't copy that. We would go ahead and play d5 and take our share of the middle of the board and call it a day. And if they decided to take their share of the middle of the board, we wouldn't copy that either. We would go ahead and exchange and then play d5 ourselves. Now, once they take on d5, we would actually get some very slight asymmetry here, and it would be a good asymmetry. My personal preference here is not to continue with ed5 and get a perfectly symmetrical position. My preference is to play knight takes d5, and then after, say, knight takes d5, e takes d5, we both have isolated pawns, but black actually has, I think, the favorable side of the asymmetry here. That very slight difference that you see with my knight on c6 attacking the pawn on d4 versus the knight on e2 defending it, I believe yields black a very, very slight edge in this position. I actually think black is better. For example, after bishop to e3, bishop to g4, white's position is actually very difficult to defend. It's very difficult to defend his pawn on the d4 square. This should yield black some sort of advantage. And in a lot of my games, and in a lot of games like under the master level, black actually can do quite well from here. Black can win games from here. So, okay, so symmetrical positions aren't completely boring, because just these tiny little asymmetries can make a world of difference, and they can make one side win over another side, and sometimes very quickly. So let's go back to this main line. So we have bishop to g7, knight f3. Now after knight f3, we're going to continue with e6. Again, we're only copying because of them happening to copy what we're planning on doing anyway, which is locking down on the d4 square. If they play a move like knight f3, we are going to continue with our plan. We're going to play e6. We're not going to be copying knight f3. So after e6, most of your opponents, I think most of the opponents on the non-master level, and even a lot of master and grandmaster level opponents, will castle in this position just because people do like to hang back and do nothing. But I wouldn't say that that's the main line. I think the main line on the top levels, although you will almost never see this on the sub 2200 level, is d4. So the main line here is d4, which is, it looks odd because it looks like it drops a pawn, and that's one of the reasons you're never going to see this on the sub 2200 level. You have to know this move to play it. So the idea is after d4, you're going to play c takes d4, and then they're going to play knight b5. So there's a dual threat with knight b5. They're threatening to come in with knight d6 check, and they're also threatening to recover their pawn on d4. This leaves black with basically one option. He has to play the move pawn to d5 in this position, which is going to give black an isolated pawn, or at least so it appears. It appears that black is going to get an isolated pawn under a lot of conditions here. So white's going to continue with the move, c takes d5, and now black has two options. He can simply accept this isolated pawn, which is fine. He can play e takes d5, or he can choose to not accept the isolated pawn. So not accepting the isolated pawn was an interesting example. It was played between Boris Gelfand and Vichy Anand in Zurich in 2013. And it was queen a5 check, queen d2, queen takes b5, d takes c6, and then Anand actually sacrificed a pawn here. He played knight to e7, knight to d4, and then we had queen b6, castles, castles, takes, and as you can see, he sacrificed a pawn for a very good reason. He's got his queen on the long diagonal covering all of the light squares that white just abandoned, and he's also got huge pressure on the b2 pawn, and white's development is really awkward. I would say if you got this position on any of the lower levels, I would not only prefer the black pieces here, I would say that black is going to be winning the majority of these games. It is just a very difficult position for white to unwind. It's a very difficult position for white to finish his development. White will have to sacrifice this pawn on b2 to finish his development at some point, regardless. So black is getting his pawn back no matter what. In this case, Gelfand managed to unwind his position, even though it was very difficult. So this game continued with Anand getting very aggressive, but Gelfand playing very accurately and not quite giving Anand enough to win at any given point. So Anand kept trying to make something happen here, kept playing really aggressively, but eventually he was just unable to get anything more out of the position than just cashing out for this pawn on b3, getting his pawn back, and then after a few more exchanges, they shook hands and they agreed to a draw. So the other option is you can just play e captures d5, and you can accept this isolated pawn in the middle of the board. This apparently isn't such a big deal. Actually, Magnus Carlsen was able to win with the black pieces against Alexander Grischuk in a chess.com game back in 2016 by using this strategy. So basically the idea is after we say castle, knight on g to e7, and then bishop to f4, castle's kingside, we are avoiding this knight to c7 check and also avoiding knight to d6 check. Black is just going to continue to try to play this position normally. Carlsen plays knight f5 to guard this pawn, but he's basically just trying to force white to weaken his kingside a little bit, and then he's going to kick this knight and continue from here. So this is really complex. He's offering the pawn on h6, but in exchange for that, he's going to get kind of a big kingside attack. So it went bishop h6, f5, and the game gets kind of wild as Carlsen just goes straight after Grischuk's king, bringing all of his pieces over to that king side, in exchange, of course, for the pawn that he sacrificed. And he is just kind of going at it, creating all of these extra complications. Eventually, they simplify everything into this endgame, and Carlsen is just continuing to press and continuing to play for a win. This is actually a very, very difficult ending for white to defend because not only is black creating lots of threats like forks, etc., he's also just threatening to win and have a couple of passed pawns over here on the queen side that he's just going to continue to push down the board and continue with this very dangerous position. So Carlsen just continues to press. He gets his two passed pawns, and then he continues to press with those two passed pawns. Just classic Carlsen style, just squeezing every last bit of water out of that rock, pushing those pawns down the board. And eventually he manages to get his pawns all the way to the end, and that is pretty much a wrap. And so this was a win for black in Grischuk versus Carlsen in the chess.com game that they played back in 2016. So again, even though these positions, they appear symmetrical, they look symmetrical, these tiny asymmetries within the position can make a world of difference. So going back to what we're going to see most often on the lower levels, basically the sub-master, sub-grandmaster level, we're going to be seeing castles kingside a lot. We're even going to see this on the master and grandmaster level as, like I said before, a lot of players do like to hang back indefinitely with white. So we would continue with knight on g to e7, and then here I think the majority of people will play a move like e3. It's also possible to continue to hang back with a move like d3. Things would get a little boring here for a while. We would castle, they would play bishop d2, and then we would just strike in the middle and get our fair share with a move like pawn to d5. And these positions are totally acceptable for black. So after e3, we would castle, and then they would continue with d4. We're going to play c takes d4. They're going to play knight takes d4, and now we're going to strike in the middle with d5. At this point, black has completely equalized, but let's say, for example, they play cd5. We've got two really good options here. One option is we can just continue with knight takes d4, e takes d4, knight d5, knight d5. And this, of course, is completely, utterly symmetrical, and they shook hands in Taimanov versus Mikhail Tal in Leningrad in 1973. It's also possible for them to play on move 12 here. It's also possible they can play, instead of knight d5, they can play the move queen b3, but after queen b6, this was again completely equal in Botvinnik versus Smyslov in Moscow in 1957. Okay, so after cd5, it's also possible to just continue with knight takes d5, e takes d5, queen b3, knight d4, e d4, bishop e6, and this position ended up being completely equal in Li Q versus Wesley So in Baku, Azerbaijan in 2015. So that game continued bishop e3, queen d7, holding the pawn on b7. And, I mean, the position's mostly symmetrical. There's this tiny asymmetry, the queen on b3 versus the queen on d7. I would say this tiny asymmetry might favor black a little bit, since black has the option to play bishop h3 at some point. But for the most part, this position is completely dead level, and that's what ended up happening in this game. Basically, stuff just got exchanged, and after a bunch of stuff got exchanged, hands were shook and draws were agreed. Black did give it a shot. He tried to do some stuff, but in the end, he ran out of stuff. So this ended up being a draw in that game between Q Lei and Wesley So in Baku in Azerbaijan in 2015. So anyways, that's basically the options that White has in the symmetrical English after c4, c5. He can play knight c3 and hang back. He can play knight f3 and go for d4. And this video basically was just covering what we're going to do if White decides to hang back. So if he plays knight c3 and he hangs back, this covers basically what your strategies are. I'm going to be doing a part 2 in this video where White plays for an early d4, and then a part 3 where White threatens to play d4 but doesn't and allows Black to play an early d5. So anyways, I hope that you found this content helpful. I hope that you can use some of these ideas in your own games, and I hope that you learned something new about chess. Thank you very much for watching.